for Friends of Asian Arts and Culture's first hybrid lecture. Because it's our first, we may run into technical problems. We'll try our best to make it work. And today we're honored to welcome our guest speaker, Claire Light, to discuss the recent tradition of activism across 3 generations of Asian Americans and the role creative work has played in our community. Claire lives in the Bay Area, but part of her root is here in Kalamazoo. She is the author of the newly published novel, Monkey Around. Here is a short introduction I found on the publisher's website. Claire Light, writing as Jadie Jang, is almost as organized, I don't know how to pronounce this, but organizing as her characters. She started a magazine, Hyphen, and an arts festival, Aperture, with a cast of Asian Pacific Americans, even more magical, if less supernatural, than the ones she writes about. She also got an MFA, went to Clarence West, and compromised between the two by publishing a collection of literary sci-fi short stories. After wrangling arts and social justice nonprofits for 17 years, her already autoimmune disease-addled body through a 7-year-long tantrum, leading our then housebound heroine into an urban fantasy addiction. A few years and a dozen Eurocentric misogyny, it's long, dominated urban fantasy series later, Claire sat up and said, I can do this. And Jadie Jang, the part of her brain that writes snarky, fun journal romps, was born. She posts about Monkey every Monday under @CLight on Twitter. Let's welcome Claire Light.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ying, for organizing this. This was very last minute, just to let everyone know. So sorry you didn't get more notice about this happening. As a lot of you know, my folks are heavily involved in setting up the Asian Art Gallery here at the KIA and also the speaker series. So when they were looking for more speakers, my mom, who is my best publicist, offered me up because I've recently published this book. And I said, well, you know, I don't know anything. My mom knows better than anyone. I don't know anything about Asian art, but I do know a lot about Asian American art because that's where my career has been. So I said, well, I'll talk about Asian American art and activism, which is the intersection where my work has happened the most, and also happens to be the setting of my novel. So we can work the little publicity angle in there as well. And I'll start with a brief background about Asians in the United States, Asian Americans, for those of you who are not familiar. Let's see, how does this work? And I did not, there we go. So there have been individuals and small groups of Asians in what's now the continental United States and Canada since before, since the 17th century, really. But the first time Asians came to the United States in really big numbers was the gold rush, and it was, of course, the Chinese. The Chinese came to work in the gold fields and ended up often serving more of a service role, doing people's laundry, serving people food, that sort of thing, and then stayed on in the United States, in California especially, but all up and down the West Coast, doing various forms of labor, which led to some problems. after the gold rush, the Chinese were actively recruited to work on the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And so there was an even larger group of Chinese who came in after California became a state, after the continental United States became fully continental. And then, of course, when the railroad was finished, there were a lot of Chinese laborers left over who were just as good laborers as white immigrants. And the white immigrants who opposed them, who competed with them, were largely immigrants and not native-born Americans. And so there was a large anti-Chinese sentiment, which grew over the course of 2 or 3 decades. Well, it started in the gold rush, but grew as the competition between laboring populations grew, and resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which ended up being extended eventually to all Asians. And it clamped down on Asian immigration for several decades thereafter. And I won't go into the whole history, but in any case, during World War II, at the same time that the United States was interning Japanese Americans, and this image is of painting by a Japanese American artist at an internment camp. At the same time that the United States was interning Japanese Americans, they were also repealing the Exclusion Act because it was a slap in the face to China, which was at the time the United States ally during World War II. So they repealed the Exclusion Act, but they kept Asian immigration down with very strict national immigration quotas. And that ended up being overturned by the Immigration Act of 1965, which ended national quotas, which were essentially race-based quotas. And of course, we still have quotas. And they're very politicized, but we're also very conscious about the optics of making them race-based. So this led to, in the 60s and 70s, some very large demographic shifts in the United States, and especially among Asian American populations. Cold War proxy wars in East Asia and Southeast Asia in the 50s, 60s, and 70s brought waves of Koreans. Prior to that, between the gold rush and World War II, there were waves of Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, and Indians for labor purposes. But then the Cold War proxy wars brought in waves of refugees of Koreans, Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Southeast Asian tribal groups like the Hmong and the Lao into the country. And they were funneled into particular areas. So there are Koreans on both coasts, and then the Southeast Asians in the Vietnam War and the Southeast Asian Wars subsequently were deliberately funneled into the center, into smaller cities in the center of the country and off of the coasts. So you'll see communities like this all over. And just a quick note, this piece here is by a Vietnamese American artist named Binh Danh, who takes historical photos, makes negatives of them, and then places them against living plant leaves, and allows photosynthesis to print the photograph on the plant, and then he preserves the leaves. Do you want to turn off the light to get a better view of that? We can't decide here if we want the lights on or off. There we go. So this is the Binh Danh piece. And I just want to give a quick note about generations. Traditionally, on the East Coast among European immigrants, the generations go, there's the immigrant generation, there's the first generation, which is the children of immigrants, there's a second generation, which is the grandchildren of immigrants, and there's the third generation. And there's a whole theory about generations that stemmed from that, and that goes along with the melting pot theory. After 1965, when the floodgates opened to non-white, non-Western, non-European immigrants, that whole system changed. The melting pot theory got thrown out the window because that depended very much on most immigrants being white Europeans. And also on the West Coast and among Asian and Latinx immigrants, it goes, first generation is the immigrant generation, second generation is the children of immigrants, third generation grandchildren of immigrants, and so forth. And there's also, very importantly, a generation 1.5, which is people who were born abroad and partly raised abroad, and brought to the United States as children and partly raised in the United States. And within Asian American communities especially, there is a distinct cultural difference between first generation 1.5s and second generation people. Okay, so the Asian American movement in the 70s changed a lot of things. So the Asian American movement came out of the civil rights movement, the free speech movement, the anti-war movement, and of course the civil rights movement turned into the Black Power movement. So the Asian American movement was influenced by both of these and was at the very beginning extremely radical. A lot of the leaders came directly out of communist groups, but there was definitely the anti-war movement also directly inspired it, where a lot of these leaders were becoming involved in the anti-war movement and surrounded by white and Black Americans, and they felt that they identified more with the Vietnamese than they did with their own fellow Americans. So that there was a powerful third world solidarity movement at the time that came out of this time as well. And so all of these kind of contributed threads to the Asian American movement. The movement activists were baby boomers who were second generation, mostly second generation. That is the children of immigrants who came during and after World War II while immigration was still restricted. So they're a very small and very particular group of people. The founders were primarily Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino American. At the time, Asian meant East Asian, and South Asians, Indians were not included. They are now. And it emphasized a pan-Asian approach and coined the term Asian American in 1968 to replace the pejorative Oriental, which is pejorative for a number of reasons. If you've read Edward Said, you would know, but basically it throws everything non-Western, everything east of the Caucasus Mountains together into one kind of general stew of effeminate, untrustworthy corruption, and I won't get into it, but so here's a photo of some of those folks in I believe New York, and this is a group called Godzilla, which was an Asian American arts group that grew out of the Basement Workshop in New York City, which was the original Asian American movement organization in New York City. So the Asian American movement was centered mostly, if not exclusively, around New York City, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area. And I say the Bay Area because it was very, not entirely, but largely campus-based. So in the Bay Area, there's San Francisco State, and in San Francisco, and on the other side, in Berkeley, there's the UC Berkeley, and both of these schools helped start the ethnic studies movement, and free speech movements were very active on both campuses, and therefore the Asian American movement kind of sprang out of both campuses as well as community arts and community building organizations in San Francisco Chinatown, as well as in Oakland Chinatown. So, and I'm going to focus from here on out mainly on San Francisco because that's my bailiwick, and that's where I know the personnel the best. Here we have a photograph of the International Hotel, which was a very interesting space. It was a hotel that took place that was located in Chinatown. Well, actually, it was located in Manilatown. It was right on Kearney Street on the border between Chinatown and Manilatown in San Francisco. And the thing is, Chinatown is still there, but Manilatown is gone. And by the late 60s, the I Hotel was the last vestige of Manilatown in San Francisco because of the financial district encroachment onto the city center, onto the urban or the ethnic enclaves in the urban center. The Filipinos had been pushed out and pushed down south into Daly City in South San Francisco. So the I Hotel, which had started out as a hotel, had turned by this point into an SRO, a single room occupancy hotel for low income elders and a few families. And most of the elders living in the I Hotel were Chinese and Filipino itinerant workers who had retired and who were from the Bachelor Society that had arisen during the Exclusion Act era, when men could come over through various means, but they couldn't bring their families over. So there are all of these Filipino American, Chinese American bachelors in their 60s, 70s, 80s in the I Hotel. And all around the ground floor were storefronts, and there was a barbershop and a pool hall and all kinds of things. But slowly over the course of the late 60s, early 70s, all of the storefronts, except the barbershop and the pool hall, were taken over by Asian American organizations, Asian American movement organizations, community organizations, advocacy organizations, and arts organizations. So the big art organization that sprang out of the I Hotel was called Kearney Street Workshop. And like I said, that there were other arts organizations like the Basement Workshop and Godzilla in New York City. East West Players was a theater company started by Frank Chin in Los Angeles, and so on and so forth. And arts were analog, entirely analog at the time, of course, and they were completely integrated into the movement from the beginning. In fact, the Kearney Street Workshop, for example, was started by a young man named Jim Dong, who was running an after-school program for, actually not really an after-school program, it was a program in Chinatown to take Chinatown gang youth off the streets and give them job training so that they could get legitimate jobs and take a different path. And it was called Leeways. And Leeways kind of petered out after a while, and Jim himself had studied art in college. So he just turned the Leeway space into an art studio, and people started just randomly coming in for art classes that he was offering. And it eventually developed into an arts organization. So this is a piece by Jim Dong. The arts, like I said, they were integrated into the movement from the beginning. And because the artists were using traditional protest art forms, and they were using them to integrate with the protests. For example, there was a lot of printmaking. This is a print piece that didn't happen to be a poster, but there were a lot of printmaking, and the artists would design posters for protests and events and classes and so forth, and also for services that they offered to the community. There was a lot of muralism. Let's see, like this. This is one of the few murals that survives from that era. San Francisco is always painting new murals and repainting things. There was muralism, which comes out of a very long tradition of muralism in North America, in Mexico, and in the United States. And interestingly enough, a lot of this work was paid for by government programs that had developed, that had originally come out of the WPA during the Great Depression, and the programs had kind of developed and changed and shifted as government funding had changed and shifted, and priorities had changed and shifted. And in the 70s was kind of the last gasp of really great government arts, community arts funding before the Reagan era came in. And a lot of these photographs you'll see here and here are actually photography by photographer artists in the community. They would attend, they would, shoot art photographs, but they would also attend all the protests and shoot the protests and the events. The Asian American movement had its own folk group, who put out an album, a historic album. And there was a zine making, broadsheets, there was spoken word poetry, there was jazz and folk music, and the two were very closely intertwined. There was a lot of taking traditional instruments and interweaving them with jazz. And this is Mia Masaoka, who plays the koto. She's Japanese American, plays the koto, and she uses it to play experimental music, noise music, and experimental jazz. Okay, so, and then interpretive and folk dance, spoken word poetry, all of these were integrated into protests and advocacy. So, so this led to, so in the late 60s and then throughout the 70s, the Asian American movement developed a new tradition of Asian American art. And I say new tradition because there was a separate tradition of Asian American art, which had not been recognized as such, and possibly had not been recognized as such until 2008. And the San Francisco exhibition called Asian American Modern Art, Asian/American/Modern/Art, which was curated by, I've forgotten one guy's name and the other guy's Mark Johnson. I had it in my notes and they're gone. But anyway, they curated this show that showed this tradition throughout the 20th century, starting at the turn of the century, 19th to 20th century, and carrying throughout the 20th century, of Asians who had been partially trained or fully trained in arts in their home countries, coming to the United States and settling here or sojourning here for a certain number of years, or possibly even settling here permanently, or their children who were born here and were trained here as artists and then were brought back and forth between Asia and the United States, and using a kind of a combination of different Western and Eastern traditions to study the landscape, because Asian American immigrants and sojourners generally come in on the West Coast, very dramatic landscapes, to study the landscape, to study the cities, and to talk about being an Asian in this incredibly raucous and high energy and still developing country. Here's one of Chiro Obata's landscape paintings, and here's a sort of a cubist. Again, name of the artist is in my notes. I'm missing it, but a cubist piece from an Asian American about Asian Americans. So there are these two traditions, the one that carries on throughout the 20th century, and every new generation of immigrants renews this tradition of examining and re-examining the United States through the eye of a newcomer, or through the eye of someone who has a kind of who exists in kind of the interstices between Asian cultures and American cultures. And then this new tradition that springs up whole from the 1970s of artists who deliberately define themselves as not Asian and not American, but Asian American, a third thing, and who are deliberately using their art to try to define that third thing. And those traditions meet actually more in my generation than in the baby boomers. So this is a more recent piece. It's a poster, a New York City poster series which just happened during the pandemic to protest Asian scapegoating. So in the late 70s, in 1977, the International Hotel was cleared. All of the residents were evicted and it was razed to the ground. And that was the end of Manila Town in San Francisco. And it also kind of calmed down the Asian American movement in San Francisco. And the Asian American movement was calming down all over the country. Leading into the 80s because of Reagan's defunding of arts and community arts programs. A lot of the organizations had either institutionalized and started taking government funding, or they died. And this was also the beginning of the culture wars of the 80s and 90s, where the organizations were, a lot of these organizations were starting to get a lot of pushback. Not just from local governments, but from the public. So, so there was a kind of a temporary lull for about 5 years. And then in 1982, Vincent Chin was murdered. For those of you who don't know or don't remember, Vincent Chin was a Chinese American in Detroit who was murdered by 2 unemployed auto workers who mistook him for Japanese. At the time that Japanese companies were taking over the auto industry, and American auto workers were being laid off in large numbers. So the Asian American movement got a second wind, still baby boomers, but kind of like the younger segment of baby boomers, and also off of the coasts. The Vincent Chin protests were centered around Detroit and centered around Asian Americans who were not on the coast, not in New York, LA, and San Francisco. So and during this era, all of the new organizations institutionalized fairly quickly. So a lot of them still exist. You can see small Asian American arts and culture organizations, as well as political advocacy organizations in non-coastal towns all over the country, which also fed off of this new influx of Southeast Asian immigrants who were funneled into the flyover states, as we call them, on the coasts. And here's some recent art made about Vincent Chin, because Vincent Chin is still very much a landmark of the Asian American movement. So, so institutionalization also forces repeated reckonings with mission statements, wrestling with purpose. If you're an institutionalized organization taking government money, how radical can you be really? What is your activism? What does your activism consist in? And it, of course, leaves it up to each succeeding generation and each succeeding a group of leaders to determine for themselves. But one of the things that happened as a result of the culture wars in the 80s and 90s was an increasing consciousness of the power and importance of representation and the lack of representation that Asian Americans in particular had in mass media. And so that led to a kind of renewing of the energy around having Asian Americans simply representing ourselves, simply defining ourselves and representing ourselves in public, and not necessarily doing anything more than that, not necessarily advocating for particular political policy, but simply representing ourselves and pushing that representation. So here's a photorealist painting of Bernice Bing, who's a very, very influential artist of the baby boomer generation. And the painting is by Lenore Chin, another very influential artist, but Lenore is maybe 10, 15 years younger. And she is coming more, she was far more active in the 80s. And she did a series of photorealist paintings of, she's also queer. So she did a series of photorealist paintings of queer couples and queer individuals and queer artists, some Asian American, some not, as part of this representation push. Oops, wrong direction. Also, community building became increasingly important with events, not necessarily outward facing events, events representing ourselves to everyone who is not us, but rather increasingly events representing ourselves to ourselves, like the Neon Machi Street Fair in Japantown. And this poster is by Leland Wong, who's one of the original Kearney Street Workshop artists. And then the Jazz Festival, the Asian American Jazz Festival, came out of Kearney Street Workshop, which kind of set off a number of different jazz festivals, Asian American jazz festivals around the country, because like I said, jazz and folk were integrated into the movement from the beginning. So it became very important to represent the way that Asian Americans integrated jazz and experimental music with traditional Asian forms. There's Jeff Chan, one of the performers from my generation. And then Kearney Street Workshop and a number of other organizations started publishing books, just created their own presses, got some ISBNs and started publishing books. Poetry especially was very important to the movement. So they started publishing poetry books. And this is one of the first, if not the first, Filipino-American poetry anthology. So then that brings us to the end of the 80s in 1989, and that is when Gen X starts to take over, and that's my generation. And Jeff Yang and a group of people start a magazine, and they're finally thinking, okay, Generation X is going to be the generation that Asian Americans break out into the mainstream. We were wrong. It's the millennials who did that, not us, but we decided that this was going to happen. This was absolutely going to happen. And what we needed was a glossy national magazine like Essence or Ebony for African Americans. So they started a magazine. This was based in New York, of course, where all publishing was based. And it lasted from 1989 to 2002, technically, although they stopped publishing in 2001 and tried to go online when everyone else was going online. And but they just happened to make the big push to go online and create this huge website right after the dot-com crash. So there was no VC money for it. They collapsed in on themselves and they had to close. So in 2002, so that was all East Coast. Before I get to what replaced them, there were also just events, annual events, festivals, film festivals, performance festivals, literary festivals springing up all over the country throughout the late 80s and throughout the 80s at all, and the 90s, because everyone was institutionalizing and because a new generation was coming of age, and all of a sudden we were here and we were looking for ways to get involved. So in 1999, Kearney Street Workshop kind of had a generational transition, which I was a part of, and we started Aperture, which is a multidisciplinary arts festival that was specific to the Bay Area. But there are any number of festivals that have been started all over the place, and some of them have lasted, like the film festival, Asian American Film Festival in Los Angeles, and the Asian American Film Festival in San Francisco. And also this happened about the time that the Jazz Festival was dying as well. So it was being replaced by multimedia and media festivals. The traditional forms, the analog forms, were giving way to electronic and digital forms and mass media forms. So Aperture started in 1999, is still going, although it had some problems after the 2008 crash. And like I said, multidisciplinary, so there's a lot of performances, and it's with the Gen X generation that we really started reaching out to South Asians and Central Asians as well, because they're not as many large waves, but because of the constant political unrest in Asia, there are constantly new groups coming over. It's more Aperture stuff. Okay, so A Magazine died, and we started Hyphen Magazine on the West Coast. And the idea was that we'd already done the glossy national Essence-like magazine. So it's time for us to do a magazine that returns to its activism roots while still being glossy and candy colored and national and enjoyable. So we started Hyphen magazine, and Hyphen was in print for about 11 years and is still active online. They transitioned to entirely online in 2014. So that's where things went in Generation X. How much time do I have? Okay, so let's try to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes. So what ended up happening was Generation X took this almost entirely in the direction of arts and media representation, while still trying to integrate this with activism, because everyone had institutionalized, everyone had become siloed. So in 2009, Oscar Grant was shot by the BART police in Oakland, and there was a huge riot, which was sort of one of the many preambles in the Bay Area on the West Coast. That was the big preamble to Black Lives Matter. Then in 2011, Occupy Wall Street happened in New York City, and quickly spread all over the country and all over the world. And in Oakland, Occupy Oakland blew up, became its own beast, became much more radical and much more anti-police and much more pro people of color and pro decolonization than the other Occupies. And there was a large contingent of people of color who were advocating for Occupy to not be called Occupy, but to be called Decolonize Oakland. They started having general assemblies. They started pushing very radical agenda, which was very different from what was happening in New York City. And they actually, this is not an Asian American artist, but they were going back to the drawing board with some of this arts integration. They actually took down a mayor who was taking her cues from the way that the other occupies around the country were being treated, and ended up clearing the encampment, and got crazy pushback from the local public, and ended up not being reelected as mayor as a result. So she had to work with the Occupy activists, and they got a new camp away from the city, slightly away from the city center, and they ended up in November, that was in October, in November, they ended up calling a general strike and shutting down the port, and then sending thousands of people to shut down the Bay Bridge. So it was a massive, massive, massive protest, which then, there's a general strike, which then kind of petered out. As we all remember, Occupy had this tremendous energy for several weeks in the fall of 2011, and then it just kind of petered out very unsatisfactorily. This right here is a piece by Kenji Liu, which is a map of the BART stations in San Francisco, or in the Bay Area, where he renamed them to decolonize them. Anyway. So, but it didn't entirely peter out. What happened, as I'm sure you're all aware, is that all of that energy split off into different movements, including Black Lives Matter, the No Dakota Access Pipeline, which many Bay Areas traveled to take part in, Me Too and Time's Up, Trump Resistance, the Women's March, and so on and so forth. And now, during the pandemic, the slow rise of disability justice, which is having a really great impact right now, which I've been getting involved in. There's been a lot of mutual aid, disability activism driven mutual aid, and protest against vaccine preferences, and proposed triage priorities, which I won't get into. So Asian American art is still finding its place in this new activist landscape. And the old institutions are standing back from it somewhat, taking note and commenting upon it, but AAPI artists are also finally, the millennials are finally moving into the mainstream, including some artists who came in through Aperture, like Ali Wong and Hassan Minaj and Jean Luen Yang. And Asian American concerns are becoming mainstream discussions, like in the television show Fresh Off the Boat, and the TV movie Always Be My Maybe, To All the Boys I've Loved Before, which is a big YA book and movie, and Shang-Chi in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And these films are not just representing Asian Americans, they're representing Asian American concerns, political concerns, and cultural concerns, and distinguishing between Asian and Asian American very clearly. So it's hard to say what role ethnic arts will have in this mainstreaming, but one direction that activism has taken is advocacy for more authentic representation and a lack of whitewashing. So right here is an image from Race Bending, which was an organization that was started around the casting of white people to take the place of Asian cartoon characters in Avatar: The Last Airbender when they made a movie of it. This caused a huge brouhaha, and there's still an organization that's protesting whitewashing casting. And then another one protesting the lack of representation in tentpole movies. This one is starring John Cho, where a bunch of people took movie posters and replaced the leading man with the actor John Cho. All right, so that brings me very briefly to my own novel, Monkey Around, which was published last year. This is based on the Monkey King, who is a Chinese epic, kind of epic novel character taken from Chinese lore. And he is probably the most famous Chinese mythological character in the Sinosphere in Asia. And he's also a trickster character. And to me, this really calls back to a lot of the artwork that my friends have made, and that a lot of, there's a very strong strain of tricksterism and humorous protest in Asian American art. This is a mini jeepney sidecar made by my Filipino-American friend, artist Mike Arcega there. This is the Manananang Google, which is by Mail Order Brides, a performance artist group, who did a kind of Google-esque sort of lecture as Manananangals, which are Filipina vampires. And this is Christina Wong, a performance artist who is also a stand-up comic, and so forth. So, so basically, in my book, it uses the trickster, kind of prankster elements of the monkey and puts it together with the Asian American activist community. And I think I'm way over time, so I think I'm going to stop there.